Hi, I'm Jackie Cohen-Roth, founder and CEO of Cannabis MD. Welcome to another Cannabis MD video profile. I am really excited today to be joined by Dr. Ethan Russo. Dr. Russo is a board-certified neurologist, psychopharmacology researcher, and founder CEO of CReDO Science. Previously, Dr. Russo was Director of Research and Development for the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute, referred to as ICCI. He was Medical Director of Phytex, and from 2003 to 2014, he was Senior Medical Advisor, Medical Monitor Study Physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for numerous phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex and Epidiolex. Dr. Russo's background as a clinician is in neurology in Missoula, Montana for 20 years. He has had faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana and in medicine at the University of Washington. He's author, editor of 7 books, and has published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Russo received his medical degree from the University of Massachusetts. So, Dr. Russo, for me, I'm talking to a rock star. So I'm very, very excited to have this opportunity.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Right away, this interest is going to the transition from neurology and a clinical practice to when and why did you become interested in cannabis science?
Well, it was a slow evolution. Somewhere around 1990, I'd been in practice for 7 years and got into a bit of a rut, at least emotionally, realizing that it wasn't helping that many people. They would come in each month, and we were dealing with increasingly toxic drugs, often with less and less benefit. I really wondered about whether there was a better way. And to me, that rekindled an interest from teen years in herbal medicine. And I was particularly interested in ethnobotany, so how indigenous people have used plants, which were traditionally medicine for most of human history, to treat various ailments. So I started out with an interest in migraine, and I looked for the place in the world where there'd been the most plant medicines used to treat headaches. And it turned out to be the Amazon. So I took some Spanish classes at night, once a week over a course of about a year and a half, and eventually found myself in Peru for a short visit, couple of weeks in 1994. Then a more concerted trip in 1995, about 3 months, working with the Machigenga tribe in the Amazon on their medicinal plants, including treatment for migraine. At that point, I'd already established in my mind that I wanted to turn my career towards medicinal plants. But when I got back, it was already 1996. Prop 215 was going on in California, and I quickly became embroiled in what we'll call the cannabis controversy. And in the course of trying to mount a clinical trial of cannabis to treat migraine, I ran afoul of the federal authorities on my efforts to try and get approval through the National Institute on Drug Abuse to do a study of cannabis and migraine. And this went on for about 3 years. By 1999, I got approval of the FDA to do such a study, but NIDA wouldn't supply the medicine to do it, despite the FDA approval. In the meantime, I had amassed a tremendous amount of information about cannabis and its therapeutic use, both historically and looking at the basic science that went behind it. Along the way, I did publish an article about cannabis and migraine, and this caught the attention of Jeffrey Guy, the chairman of GW Pharmaceuticals, in 1998, the year that they began. So they had a license from the British Home Office to develop cannabis-based medicines as pharmaceuticals. I signed on as a scientific advisor, and 5 years later, they asked me to come on full time. Subsequent to that, I was involved in the Sativex clinical development program and subsequently the Epidiolex program. Then subsequent to that, I branched out into the private companies that you mentioned and culminating this year with our own company. So at the age of 68, I decided that it was time to try and do it our way rather than somebody else's way.
Yeah, well, congratulations on your work and the impact that it's had on millions of people across the globe. If you would give some background for our viewers that are going to be less familiar with Sativex as well as Epidiolex.
Sure. Okay, so somewhere around 1998, GW Pharmaceuticals started out with a couple of big advantages. One was that they got the germplasm, the plant material from a company called Hortifarm in the Netherlands that was begun by a group of American expatriates. So they had already done advanced work on selective breeding of high THC chemovirus, chemical varieties of cannabis, as well as cannabidiol, which was unknown to the vast majority of people around the world, including people who are using cannabis. Sort of been bred out of American cannabis over the course of decades. Additionally,
meaning, let me just interrupt you there. So some clarity, meaning that, so being bred out, is that what certainly in the industry of late focused on creating these chemovars are very high in THC. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. I mean, basically, that was all that was available in the US in whatever capacity. So already they've established a couple of things. Number one, that cannabis should be a pharmaceutical in its own right as a botanical, meaning as a whole plant medicine, rather than isolated single molecular entity, which is the basis of most pharmaceutical research. Between 1998 and 2000, they did a lot of research on best delivery methods and what combination of THC and CBD predominant extracts would be best. So there's a tremendous amount of work that took place in that interval. By the year 2000, they'd already established pretty much the basis for the extracts that they'd be using subsequently in the clinical work, which began then. So already by about 2000, they were giving this to people. And what they happened upon was Sativex. So they had started out with an extract high in THC and other components, and a separate extract from different plants high in cannabidiol. And they established that the best preparation was a 1-to-1 mixture of the two. And the best delivery technique was a spray in the mouth, what we call oromucosal, oral area, and the mucosa is the surface of the inside of the cheeks and the tongue and what have you. And that combination became what's known as Sativex. So they had also looked at the best indications, why to give this to people. At the time, the predominant reason that people were using cannabis as medicine in the United Kingdom was treatment of multiple sclerosis. So that was a big focus. But what aspect of MS would be most advantageous? They looked at pain, and it was effective there. And they looked at spasticity, muscle tightness associated with multiple sclerosis. And the latter became the lead indication. And this was approved in Canada in 2005 and about 2011 in Great Britain and eventually the remainder of the European Union. It's gone on to be approved in 30 countries, not including the US. Along the way, a company called Otsuka in Japan picked up the rights to use Sativex to treat cancer pain. And studies were done, including in the US. There were clinical trials, over 100 sites actually, where Sativex was given to American patients. Ultimately, however, what happened was that it worked in the American patients, but it wasn't so successful in the Eastern European patients that tended to be much more advanced in their disease. Ultimately, although it passed in terms of safety of the preparation and the consistency of the preparation, they couldn't quite show the efficacy on pain in these advanced cancer patients, many of whom were near death. Um, but the company apparently plans to go back and try again with multiple sclerosis in the US. Along the way, GW had always had the interest in cannabidiol. And again, this was pretty much unknown to most people in the US. They did a lot of research in different areas, including inflammation, treatment of arthritis, and in particular, treatment of epilepsy. So it'd been known since the 70s that there was an anticonvulsant effect of cannabidiol. In other words, it reduced electrical excitability of the brain that led to seizures. In the course of researching this, eventually they decided to pursue a clinical program with what became known as Epidiolex, which is essentially a 97% pure CBD preparation. Now, I have to make a point of distinction here. It felt all along that this was a little bit different than the original mission of the company, which was to look at extracts involving all the different components and the synergy, the boosting effect of them, what we call the entourage effect, the idea that it's not a single molecule that is responsible for the clinical effect of the medicine, but rather you can do it better with these complex formulations that we call extracts, because some are going to be complementary. They might have anticonvulsant properties of their own, but also reducing side effects of THC. Part of the problem was, in applying to the FDA, it was clear that they had no interest whatsoever in any THC being given to children. And particularly since the program was aimed at Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, two severe epilepsy syndromes of childhood and subsequently adults, it was clear that good medicine was needed, but the issue was what was going to be optimal. So eventually, subsequent to that, Epidiolex was approved, and it's essentially a CBD preparation, which is fine. It works well. There are some issues, however. CBD is a remarkable medicine, but it's not potent. What this means is you need a large amount of it to exert the clinical effects. Because of this, there are a couple of important repercussions. One is it makes it very expensive. And number two is that at very high doses, cannabidiol does have some drug-drug interactions, particularly with other anticonvulsants like valproic acid that these children with these terrible epilepsy syndromes have to take. So it's created a lot of issues. At the same time, it had been noted that equivalent results in treating seizures could be obtained with CBD at about 20% of the dose if there were other components present. So if the question is, what's the best preparation to treat epilepsy? I would maintain it's probably not one molecule, but rather an extract that combines different components and their synergistic effects. So I think that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, I think there's a lot in there that I can try to unpack. So when you're talking about the other components in it, synergy, so and the entourage effect, so I believe you're referring to the terpenes and the value of adding and having the terpenes.
Sure.
And that goes to then a question of distinction between Epidiolex being the first plant-based medicine, pharmaceutical product medicine, and that it does not contain any terpenes. And as you,
Tiny amounts.
okay, which one? Mine. Okay, great. This is
Well, I couldn't tell you which ones. That's part of the proprietary.
because then we could all go make some Epidiolex.
But let's put it this way. What could have been done differently? Well, THC is anticonvulsant. Again, the FDA didn't like the idea of this being given to kids, although let's put this in context. A child with Dravet syndrome or Lennox-Gastaut syndrome almost universally is going to be very severely impaired
Yes.
cognitively. And they're degenerative diseases. Unless these are effectively treated, these children will fail to make developmental milestones and eventually will die at a young age. There is nothing that THC that would do in a deleterious fashion that remotely compares with what happens if you don't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. That goes to the, that benefit risk analysis of
course.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And this is just, to use the colloquial expression, it's a no-brainer. There's no comparison between whatever damage they think that THC would do, which I think is vastly exaggerated. We have to make a distinction between what happens if someone smokes huge amounts of cannabis. That's not necessarily going to do great things for their career. But in comparison, the tiny doses that are needed of THC to treat whatever it is therapeutically, there's no ascribable risk or damage attendant to such use. And again, this is the difference between a medicine and a poison. It has to do with dosing. So we continue to have, for lack of a better term, unjustifiable hysteria about THC. I think a lot of this is just born of ignorance, but also politics. I think that some people think that everyone who takes a medicine with THC is suddenly going to be waving the peace sign and voting Democratic or something ridiculous. So, I mean, that could happen, but again, there may be worse things.
Yeah. And it's interesting is that Epidiolex coming from the UK, and that the UK has such a restrictive posture towards the opportunity for patients to have access to the medicine. I've had the opportunity on a previous profile to chat with Hannah Deacon, who is leading the charge with his son on the cause of so many, but how she got into it was providing care for her, best treatment for her son Alfie. And it's just, and then it just, I immediately think like, okay, there's some heavy duty lobbying dollars that are restricting access to medicine?
No, it's really tragic. I mean, basically, Sativex in the 30 countries where it's approved isn't really available in most of those because it hasn't been marketed or it isn't reimbursed. In the UK, what happened is what they call a postal code lottery, meaning that depending on where you lived, it might be covered by the National Health Service. But if you lived in the wrong place, it wasn't. And so their access has been abysmal, despite the fact that it was developed there. But let's look at the situation in the US. Basically, nobody can make cannabis-based medicine here. Basically, we've ceded that capability to the rest of the world, which explains why for a majority of the last 24 years, I've worked for foreign companies. You simply couldn't do the kind of research and development in this country that's necessary. And that remains the case. And despite whatever advances there have been state by state, the situation on the federal level isn't that much different than it was in 1996. So progress is glacial at best.
Yeah. And it's interesting. And to my understanding, as I've researched the why this exists, I mean, certainly with the Schedule One, but I had come across sort of this landmark study in the as part of that it plays in that the access for the universities to have opportunity for research was in 1970. I just want to drill down. So my points are a little bit sketchy at best right now, but a California-based university, I don't know if it's UCLA or Stanford, partnered with a research team in Spain and actually found that there was benefits in treating breast cancer with cannabis. And so it was under Ford's administration at that time that he shut this down. And that, are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically the facts are that there was National Institute of Health sponsored research in the mid 70s showing the benefits of cannabis in treating cancer. Basically, then nothing happened for 20 years. The information was suppressed. Under the Reagan administration, there was a concerted effort to purge a lot of information about benefits of cannabis from libraries, etc. So things were really set back.
Yeah, and that was, I said the irony of that time, again, back into the Ford administration. So again, 1970, and as you said, that they've done a good job of purging information. As best I could find was some reference to an article that was in the Washington Post and referencing that this was available on microfiche. Well, who has access to microfiche anymore? But and then the irony is that the Ford administration and that Betty Ford, her history of substance abuse, as well as being treated for breast cancer. So there's a lot of iron in there, unfortunate. And that cannabis science has not been able to move forward in the US. So that goes to the next question. So do how are we going to overcome that? Is it best that we, cannabis is rescheduled as a 2? No, why not?
That's not going to really materially change anything. First of all, it doesn't belong there. A little bit of history. There was a Supreme Court case won by Timothy Leary that basically voided the 1937 prohibition of cannabis. So for a while, 18 months, there was no federal law against cannabis. However, it had no force or effect because all 50 states had their own prohibitions. But what happened was they needed to substitute something for it that eventually became the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. They weren't sure what to do with cannabis. So initially it was placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive category, with LSD and heroin as a placeholder, pending the results of a presidential commission, the Schaefer Commission, which came out in 1972. However, before the results were even announced, which were that cannabis should be decriminalized and should be available medically, President Nixon said no such thing and basically rejected the findings even before they were done. And it's remained in Schedule 1 ever since, despite the fact that it is a scientific fallacy. It was never the case that it was dangerous, addictive, had no recognized medical use. This is a substance that's been used medically by humans for thousands of years. It was a mainstream drug in this country for a century between 1840 and 1940. And there were cannabis preparations by Merck and Lilly and any of the big companies that you could name. So it's just been one vast propaganda operation.
Yeah, and so then it's an interesting question with my understanding that these laws that are so restrictive on research and developing medicines and understanding dosing and all these things that physicians and healthcare providers need to move forward are all based on this racially prejudiced laws from starting with Ainslinger in the 30s. And
Sure.
so starting in the US and the impact across the globe on restriction and countries having their own federal restrictions with cannabis, but yet you have a number of countries that are, as you had said, are moving far ahead of the US. And so with Germany, Australia, Israel, the UK, as far as the GW Pharmaceuticals. So why is it? Why is the US not, or is the US not moving as fast as the other countries?
Well, it's because of these prohibitions and the scheduling, the inability
Right.
to do any domestic research aimed towards commercial development of a pharmaceutical. So, especially for, I'm going to pick on the conservatives right now. If
Mm-hmm.
you're interested in commerce, why would it be logical in any respect for us to cede the ability to pursue
Exactly.
this area of commerce to the rest of the world? The United States has great scientific capability and entrepreneurial spirit. Why shouldn't that be harnessed towards this area? People are doing it anyway. They're having to do this on their own with lack of quality control or useful information or safety protocols. Why not do it properly and make this available? So, I would argue with anybody about this.
Mm-hmm.
It's made into a moral issue, and morality has nothing to do with this. We're talking about medicine, and that should be between a physician and patient.
Mm-hmm. Well, so
Instead,
we're,
the patients are on their own.
I'm sorry, say that.
Instead, the patients are just on their own.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, it's truly, isn't it dangerous? In that, but nobody, to the best of my understanding, nobody has died from a THC overdose. But we do have, of course, possible complications with the drug-drug interactions. And then let's, from that conversation, if you would, let's clarify. We've talked about plant-based medicine, whether it's a synthetic based or made in a lab, a THC or CBD, and then what is a artisanal? What are the differences?
Okay, well, there are basically three echelons of
Mm-hmm.
cannabis preparations. At the top, you've got pharmaceutical preparations such as Sativex and Epidiolex that we've discussed. These have been through the regulatory process. They've had randomized controlled trials done that show safety, efficacy, and consistency. So for many physicians, this is the only thing that they're going to accept. But again, access is very limited, tremendous expense attached. At the next level, you've got supplements. So this would include, at this point, hundreds or thousands of preparations that are available on the internet or in dispensaries, usually CBD based.
Mm-hmm.
Um, these have varying levels of quality control. Basically the FDA can intervene. It's usually only after somebody complains or the ingredients don't match the labeling, this kind of thing. Finally, you've got herbal cannabis or artisanal preparations that are made from herbal cannabis. Again, these may or may not be good. This is primarily the way most people are going to use cannabis, but it's not subject to a lot of quality control in most instances. Again, this is something I'd like to see different, and that should come from legalization. Legalization also means regulation, so that safety, consistency, things like this can be monitored, and that the consumer has a knowledge base attached to whatever they're purchasing.
So this goes back to the question conversation about is Schedule 2 the best avenue, and no. So what is the best?
Well, first, let's explain why Schedule 2 or other schedules
Yes.
aren't going to work. Schedule 2 really it assumes that there's a pharmaceutical preparation that's available that would then be controlled. It would have to have a monthly written prescription. It just doesn't apply. Cannabis doesn't belong in a schedule. Yes, I believe it should be regulated, but it doesn't work in the scheduling. Um, and this is not to say that some people don't use too much THC and get into trouble, but the current scheme has not worked and will never work. And it's been 50 years now at this point. So it's abundantly clear to anybody that wants to look at this dispassionately that it needs to be done differently.
All right, and let's go back to, well, thank you for that, and the value of terpenes.
Right. So first, what are they? Well, these are aromatic compounds in cannabis as well as fruits, vegetables. So these are the things that give citrus its characteristic smell, or many flowers their smell, and also the smell of cannabis. Interestingly, the cannabinoids themselves, THC, CBD et al., have no odor. And this has been controversial. It's been in the government's self-interest for decades to say that the pharmacology, what cannabis does, is all related to THC. But this was never true. There have always been differences in one chemical variety of cannabis opposed to another. Why do you think there are hundreds of different kinds of cannabis? It's and you could have two with exactly the same concentration of THC, but
Are you saying, when you say, excuse me for a second, just clarifying, so when you say different kinds of cannabis, you're talking about different strains?
Yeah, except I don't use that term.
Or chemovars?
Yes, chemical varieties. Strains applies to viruses and
Okay, thank you.
plants. So a little technical quibble there. But consumers will tell you that one cannabis is quite distinct from another. When they use one, they may feel very innervated and want to go out and clean the garage. Another one is going to be very sedating, and they'll be subject to what's called couch lock, where basically they're immobilized. That's fine if you need to relax or sleep. It's not good if you have chronic pain and need to work or study. So what really makes the difference? Well, there are two things. The ratio of different cannabinoids, but we've already discussed how most cannabis that's available is high THC. If there is a difference between one cannabis and another, what does it due to? Well, it has to be something else, and the something else is the terpenoid content. So these, again, are aromatic compounds. They're in much smaller amounts, but they're very potent. And some of them are psychoactive in and of themselves. What they do is change the way THC works. Some of them may be complementary. THC has pain-killing properties, but some of the other terpenoids do as well, so they can have an additive or synergistic boosting effect. Many of them will reduce side effects of THC, and a salient example would be what's called alpha-pinene. That sounds familiar because it's got pine in it. Pine scent is due primarily to alpha-pinene. What alpha-pinene does, get technical here for a second, it's what's called an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. Acetylcholine is the memory molecule in the brain. If you inhibit its breakdown, you can boost memory. One of the key things that THC does is impair short-term memory. So that leads to the phenomenon you see in Cheech and Chong, which is we're talking in, what were you saying? That kind of thing, where you lose your place. That can be totally mitigated or eliminated if there's alpha-pinene in the mix. And there are countless other examples that complement or reduce side effects of the cannabinoids. Now, there are people that say this is an unproven concept, the entourage concept. But in fact, there are many, many examples, both from basic science and from clinical studies, that show the benefits of these combinations as opposed to THC on its own.
And that, yeah, really interesting comment about alpha pinene. And I skipped right over is that you're January 7th, you're going to be joining Dr. Patricia Fry and Dr. Bonnie Goldstein on a webinar where we're going to be talking about neurologic disorders and the efficacy of medical cannabis treating Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism. And so with alpha pinene, immediately I thought of the value of treating Alzheimer's.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so can you?
Right. Well, there are a couple of drugs that are approved in Alzheimer treatment that don't arrest the deterioration of the disease, but the idea behind them is as acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So being a boost to memory, but it seems to be a temporary effect. Now, here's where things get really interesting. So we mentioned alpha pinene, but what about other cannabis components? Both THC and CBD have been shown to interfere with the accumulation of beta amyloid, an abnormal protein that is one of the problems that accumulates in the brains of Alzheimer's disease patients. And if we can interfere with that process, that may be a treatment that will slow or arrest the deterioration in the disease. So there are two things you want to do in treating Alzheimer's disease. One is treat the symptoms, allow people to sleep better, prevent agitation, help with their memory. But the holy grail in treatment is to arrest the progression or even ideally reverse damage that's already there, although that is likely to be extremely difficult. But cannabis-based preparations hold out this promise. There are already people using cannabis in symptomatic treatment. For instance, agitation in patients in nursing homes. This has been done quite a bit in some facilities in California, for example.
Yeah, I have a particular interest in Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, I lost my dad, and he was a brilliant pathologist, and he knew when it was coming on, and he would say that he was losing his marbles. And I witnessed his, obviously, as we all do, is watching our family members succumb. But with that agitation, with the sundowning effect, and I often wonder, he was a man of science, very conservative, and I wonder what he would have done if he would have taken advantage of the opportunity to use cannabis. And of course, are Alzheimer's patients aware?
Well, part of the problem is often they're not.
Yeah.
When you have someone that's really intelligent to begin with, they will realize early on that they're slipping.
Yeah.
But more often, people are really not aware of their impairment.
And this goes to the caregivers. And this, again, and this drilling down is then that removing the stigma that surrounding cannabis as an adjunctive therapy that can offer so much benefit to the patients as well as the caregivers and their family members. What do you see as things that you're involved in right now? Product development with CReDO. What's on the forefront?
Well, we've got a lot of things. Some of this we have to keep secret. We've got 7 provisional patents right now that we're working on. There are a couple of diagnostics related to the endocannabinoid system. One we've already provided rational basis for. It's for a rare disorder that currently doesn't have a diagnostic test. The other one is in process. We don't have an answer yet. This is for a very common condition. If we happen to be right about what we're hypothesizing here, to have application not to just treatment of this disorder, but many other related conditions. We're interested in industrial applications. A lot of what we're doing is non-THC based. So hopefully these would be preparations that would be saleable across state lines and internationally without a lot of problems, but again, that's subject to political whims. Um, but we're trying to make cannabis safer and better. It's one of our mottos, and we're really dedicated to that process.
Yeah, and that goes just as we've kind of skirted around, but mentioned is that there is a lack of standardization of best practices, state to state and certainly country to country. One last question for you. Do you think that as you have so much work in the international markets, is one country or is EU doing any better of establishing best practices in the cannabis industry versus the US?
Well, there are problems everywhere.
Yeah.
We can use one example, Germany. They have very strict standards, but one
Mhm.
of the implications of their rules are that you can't grow the material in Germany. They're having to import from other places. Obviously that's an impediment. There's some great
Right.
scientists there that could be applying their talents to these issues. Um, there, there's no place that's doing it right. I would say right now.
Everybody has their version of doing it wrong, but we are slowly making progress. So I want to again thank you so much for the generosity of your time, and really excited to be speaking with you again with Doctors Fry and Goldstein as we dive deeper into neurologic disorders and the application of medical cannabis. So thank you so much, and I'll see you again on January 7th.
Thank you for the opportunity.